Hi, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Kristy, and welcome back to another parent-teacher conference, where we believe that conversations about our kids shouldn't just happen once or twice a year, but they should be an ongoing dialogue.
In this episode, we want to focus on the topic of human potential. So, what is human potential? Well, when optimized, it's the ability to trust and nurture human intuition, ability, expression, and creative works. I think it is something that brings full expression to our innermost desires. It's to be in connection and harmony with ourself and others. It's the ability to imagine and believe in what has not yet been materialized. And of course, sustain efforts and have the freedom to create and recreate conditions to allow human expressions to come to fruition. When we aren't on our best, it could look like fear or disharmony with self or others, stagnation or lack of expression. And, when thinking about this topic in relationship to schools, we assume schools to be a place of potential to unfold. And we often assume because our children are in school that learning is happening there. Something is being absorbed or influencing our children. But I think the critical question is it the thing that we want our children to be a part of? Is it really supporting their learning and their innate abilities? In this episode, we want to think about how potential is currently understood in our schools, because how we perceive the topic can influence what it is we do day in and day out. It shapes how we prioritize our time and the effort we make. Kristy, I'd like to turn it over to you and get your insight. How would you define human potential?
I think, speaking from the position of a mother with two young children, what immediately comes to mind for me is the idea of a newborn baby. Perfectly sweet, innocent, naive, and capable of so much. This little person who's really imbued with all of their parents' hopes and dreams for their potential, right? The idea that they can be anything in this world. And as that baby grows into a child, so much of their potential is going to depend on their identity, their agency, their ability to self-actualize. And so how that gets shaped, I think, has a lot to do with the spheres of influence around the child. If we think about the age-old debate of nature versus nurture, that's really been reshaped into, as I understand it, nature via nurture, which suggests that these two concepts are inextricably linked and both really, really relevant in how a child is shaped and formed. So, for example, someone might have a genetic predisposition for higher intelligence, but if their environment means that they're under chronic stress or they don't receive proper nutrition, then those genes might not actualize in the way that they were maybe intended. So both the care that the child receives and their genetic predisposition are relevant factors in looking at human potential. But going back to the environment piece, the adults that are around them and trusted with their care play such a pivotal role in who that child is and will become. And when I think about those spheres of influence, schooling is such an integral part of that. It's estimated that an average student between kindergarten and grade 12 will spend between 15,000 and 16,000 hours in a classroom. So it's very clear that school plays a vital role in determining that self-conception, capacity, and agency of an individual child.
Thanks, Kristy. I loved what you said. And as a mom to a newborn baby, your example of how a parent looks at a newborn child really resonates with me. Because when you do look at a child, especially for the first time, your eyes light up, your heart is screaming, it's beating from your chest like, wow, this child really can be anything that they want to be. And there is nothing in the way of you seeing that. And so as children grow, I'm hoping our conversation can think about those things that might get in the way of seeing the potential or the possibility of a child. Because every child in a school setting was a newborn at one point in their life. They were looked at with that gaze of love. And so, I'm curious about the things in our school that might detract or take away from that openness and that encouragement, or that, again, that gaze of love that a child receives in the first moments of life.
And I think what that has me thinking about stuff too is the relationship between parents and a school. Given that such a large allotment of hours of a child's day are spent in this school system, it means that the spirit of what public education, I think, is conceived of, strives towards, is a relationship of trust between a parent and a child. For any parent who's had to experience that first day of drop-off, whether it be for JK or for daycare, the idea that you have to take this little baby and drop them off, essentially into a stranger's arms, there's so much trust imparted on that institution and those people to care for your child. And so I think about that as a really sacred thing. Having been a teacher and been in the education system for over a decade, I definitely see where that trust is not fully intact. And it makes me think about that, right? Like, what is the current status of trust between parents and schools? And what's been lost along the way. So from your lens, Steph, how would you describe the current state of our public system when it comes to that trust?
Think trust sometimes, I think it's always a work in progress. And I think it's a delicate dance between both parent and teachers. I think that there can be beautiful moments where trust has been built. And I think that we're also in a maybe in a time of strain, or our system is feeling under pressure. And so sometimes when the school system, maybe due to lack of resources or other things that are surfacing, when we're under stress, it can place us in an emotional state of fear or judgment, or make us really critical. And then that can get away in the way of building trust. So I think that this dance of trust is being constantly negotiated. And given the current climate of our school system, I think right now, when people can't name the very problem or the thing that's causing, fear or dissatisfaction with how school is going, it's easy to turn it on one another rather than, you know, taking an objective standpoint and saying, these are the conditions that are causing, these, problems or concerns that I'm feeling.
And I think really what we're seeing right now play out as well is the idea that the spirit of what schooling and education ought to be is so often at odds with the bureaucratic realities around a system that is responsible for housing and governing the safety of so many children at once. In Ontario in particular, there's a lot of broken trust, I think, with what's happening in the news right now. We've seen 8 total school boards basically be taken over by the Ministry of Education because of the breakdown of that trust. And they've done so under Bill 33, but the concern that I think a lot of parents, teachers, even administrators have is that really feels like the lost stakeholder input. And I think the spirit of what education ought to be and the way it's structured really requires input from different parties at different levels of the system to be able to have that input for how best to educate children, nurture their potential, keep them safe, allow them to thrive and to grow on the basis of that trust. Sometimes a particular school is subject to the governance of a particular administrator or superintendent's pedagogical priorities, right? So is there a focus in a particular school on community building, on social emotional learning through character education, improving test scores, prioritizing safety and discipline? Is there that willingness to hear from other stakeholders on the practices or the best practices of that school, to hear about the issues, the budgetary concerns, the class sizes? Is there that platform for those voices?
As you were speaking, a couple of things came to mind, right? I think you were focusing or bringing to light a lot about the structure of education and also the environment that's created in that current structure. I just wanted to bring up Gabor Maté in the book The Myth of Normal. Gabor Maté, for those who don't know, he's a physician and a speaker, and he does a lot of work on trauma, being a Holocaust survivor. But particularly in his book, as I mentioned, The Myth of Normal, he dives into our current environmental conditions that we consider to be commonplace, normal, that we wouldn't really necessarily bat an eye at because they're so ingrained in how we do life. He assesses the environment that we're living in, and he talks about how actually we're creating a lot of unhealthy conditions in our environment that don't yield the best potential. And he analyzes all, various facets of society, but particularly he also talks about the school system. And it's funny because he was an educator for a short couple years in his early career. But he talks about in chapter 8 the idea of human potential. What he says particularly, or what he points to, is he talks about human adaptability. He says that we are adaptable by nature, and in the process of evolution, that has been really helpful for us because we have the ability to shift in different environments, and that helps us in terms of our survival as a species. However, he does caution us and say that just because we can adapt doesn't mean we should continue to adapt and replicate all environments. So we've gotten used to something, doesn't mean it's should be our current mode of existence? And I think this provides a helpful line of inquiry in our conversation. There's a question in there that I'd like to highlight. He says, what circumstances evoke what set of outcomes? So when we think about this in terms of education, what potential will manifest or come into existence based on the current environmental conditions of our school system? So I love that thinking because it, first of all, places us in a position to see that we have power to change things. That if we can think about our environment, what is going on, and think about its outcomes, then we then have the potential or opportunity to change those circumstances and adapt, because that is kind of, who we are by nature. We can adapt. I think the point of the conversation is to spotlight some of those environmental conditions that we want to think critically about and how we might want to move forward and create space for new adaptations.
I love that, Stephanie. I think that's such an important point. If we're thinking about human potential and we're going back to, like I said, that framing age-old argument of nature versus nurture, we have to consider the environment, right? And we have to consider how the structure and the system in place benefits and nurtures children or creates a set of circumstances that are inhibitive of them reaching that potential. And I think at this stage, it would be helpful to sort of frame and outline for parents what exactly our school system entails at each individual level. What does that look like? So from the top down, the very top, at the government level, provincially, we have the Ministry of Education, which is responsible for the administration of curriculum, the allocation of the budget. They essentially decide what every student has to learn from kindergarten all the way through to grade 12. And they are responsible for enacting the law, which governs education as outlined in the Education Act. Beneath the ministry, we have 72 school boards, and those are made up of four systems: English Public, English Catholic, French Public, and French Catholic. And at each board, there is essentially a CEO of the board known as the Director of Education. Beneath them are supervisory officers who oversee a specific family or grouping of schools or a specific portfolio like special education. And then there are the individual schools themselves, which would have the principal, who's essentially the manager of the school, one or two vice principals, depending on the school size, classroom teachers, business, and additional support staff. And that kind of makes up the educational ecosystem that we know.
So why bring this to our attention, Kristy? Why is it important for us to understand the structure of the school system?
I think if we go back to that question of trust that you were speaking about, Stephanie, I think without understanding exactly how the system is broken down and who's responsible for what, it can be easy to place blame on a system at large, on an individual teacher whose hands might be tied for sordid reasons. And so I think in having this conversation, it's good to kind of outline what the system looks like, who's responsible for what allocations of safety of curriculum, what power an individual teacher has, an administrator has, or doesn't have, right, in order to understand the ask that comes from parents. So without that information, it can be difficult to know where to even start when you have a concern, right? And without knowing how to navigate the system, it can also be really difficult to get the resources and support that you need for your child too.
As you talk about this, a question that's coming to mind is there a collective narrative that's kind of weaving through this school structure that, regardless of who you are in the system or where you're located, in the GTA or Northern Ontario, is there something that kind of all stakeholders might be marked by that creates limitations to what our school system is right now? One thing that comes to mind is there was a report issued by the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association, and the report is called A System Under Strain: Violence and Harassment in Ontario Schools. And I just wanted to bring this report forward because I think it might give us one of those narratives that are weaving through the system. In this survey that happened in the spring of 2025. 2,873 teachers answered the survey, and when necessary, the results were compared to the 2017 data. And overwhelmingly, the response or the cry from teachers is that there has been a significant amount of violence experienced or witnessed in the workplace. So just to be more specific, 7 10 say they have personally experienced an act of violence at school, while more than 4 in 5 have witnessed violence directed at a colleague. And again, when thinking about the data from 2017 showing that violence is not only persistence, but there has been, I guess, a worsening of it in schools. I wanted to bring forward a quotation from the report from one anonymous educator. It says, I've witnessed students as young as kindergarten swearing, hitting, biting, choking, throwing chairs and objects, damaging property, and hurting educators and support workers. Another quote is, I spend more time thinking about how to keep myself and my students safe than how to teach a lesson. And another thing, that is also coming up from the report that I want to call attention to is that there is a cry from educators of the systemic pressures that are creating these conditions, like insufficient staffing, unmet student mental health needs, limited access to professional supports for students, and a lack of effective intervention strategies. A lot of them talk about, classrooms being stretched beyond their capacity. So when I hear this, I kind of I feel disheartened, but I'm also reminded a little bit about, what Gabor Maté was talking about. If I'm, putting a lens on from his perspective about environmental conditions, it sounds like there is a system that is under strain. It sounds like there's a system that is in need of support. Um, Gabor Maté talks about central attachment relationships. He says that every child needs an adult figure to help them meet their needs and be securely attached to, which helps them to thrive and moves beyond safety. Or once is that need for safety and that secure attachment is met, they have opportunity to thrive. When we think about a classroom setting with, again, as described in the report, lack of resources, lack of funding, insufficient systems in place to help support young people, children are tending to have their central attachment figures towards peers their age rather than an adult. If there's like 33 kids, if I'm thinking about when I was young, I was in a grade 5 class and there's 33 of us and one educator. So when you're having classroom sizes that big, how could you possibly get your needs met by one person? How can you possibly have an environment where emotional regulation is prioritized? Not that it isn't the wish or the interest of people, but that it becomes a real difficulty to tend to many to students in that space. I know I threw a lot at you there, Kristy, but as I walk through the report, are there any initial impressions or thoughts that come to mind?
The initial impression is one of feeling so disheartened for teachers, for parents, and I think first and foremost for the kids, right? Because they're the ones who are really suffering as a result of this. I think their learning's being affected, their sense of safety, certainly their sense of potential. If I think about Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, right? Safety is a fundamental human need. And so if kids are coming to school and not feeling safe because the violent acts in their classroom space are that frequent, and the teacher is having to approach their temperament in the space because the teacher really sets the tone in the room around one of angst and prevention rather than hands-on, careful attunement to child's needs, that completely shifts the entire atmosphere for everybody in the room, right? And so I think first and foremost, just so much empathy and heartache for knowing that that's the reality that we're speaking about. And then I think secondly, I find myself connecting that reality back to the legal implications in the system and the question of what that means and looks like. And this is, like you mentioned, a system under strain. And we talked about trust between parents and a school. Because that trust is so sacred, it's also hinged on a legal responsibility of administrators and the school system itself to keep children safe while they're there. So I'm wondering if what the report is revealing is this kind of safety paradox where the system has had to become so focused on legal liability that it ignores sort of the moral duty to nurture a child's full potential because the class sizes are so large and they're so not conducive to an atmosphere that allows learning and growth potential to flourish. So if I think about the structural implications here in the legal context, which is relevant to frame for parents as well. So I mentioned the Education Act is the legal document that governs education in our province as administered by the ministry. But in particular, school safety is communicated through PPMs. So those are program policy memorandums that are issued to boards and to individual administrators. And they're entrusted with governing safety, discipline, removal of students when safety standards are not being met. And a lot of that is outlined in the code of conduct. The common law tradition that's relevant for parents to know here that applies is a term called in loco parentis. So this is Latin for in place of a parent, and it's the legal doctrine for our school system that defines a school's relationship to a student. Under this doctrine, while a child is at school, the teacher and the board take on the functions and responsibilities of the parent. So in Ontario, our courts have discerned something called the standard of care. And basically what this means is that there's a careful parent test, which requires a teacher to legally act in a way which is judicious or prudent to what a parent would do in the same circumstances. So when examining child safety, a teacher has to ask, if these students were my children, what would I, as a careful or prudent parent, do to fulfill my duty of care? And I bring up this context and this terminology to say that if that is the legal responsibility of our schools, our principals, and our teachers, that has to be met, and we're seeing this prevalence of violence, then of course that is going to be at the forefront of how schools are functioning, which means that they're really not prioritizing anything else because that legal responsibility has to be met first and foremost. And I think an important point here to highlight that the report speaks to is that an act of violence is most often a form of communication arising from an unmet need from a child. So everything from inadequate access to mental health resources, to being in a class size that's too large, to a lack of special education supports. And we know that there have been significant cuts in our public education system, which have resulted in those larger class sizes and the lack of resources needed for a lot of these kids.
Okay, that speaks to me, especially when you talk about this idea that every act of violence comes from an unmet need. I was supply teaching in a kindergarten classroom, and there was a little boy there who was sick, and I guess he soiled his clothing, he vomited, and there was a wonderful EA there who helped him guided him to the bathroom to get cleaned up. And then after, he was just crying, and so she picked him up, placed him, the little boy on her lap, and held him until his mother could get there. And I think about that because it is a beautiful example of how, educators can rise to the challenge. But at the same time, I'm thinking about, the other 27 students in the room. How many students at that moment also had an unmet need that couldn't necessarily be cared for, or maybe they didn't know how to vocalize it, or because didn't have necessarily an attuned teacher who could pick up on it because they're juggling many hats. So, that little boy had a very physical need that was out in the open, and it elicited compassion, patience, understanding, and time. And I think about, the other kids in the room. What were their needs in that moment where that little boy was crying? Who else had a need at the time that might have not been met? So it is definitely a challenging space to be navigating, when you're in there. And this is not to critique the intentions of people. I think we're all well intentioned, but we're also thinking about the actuality of things, what is actually happening in our classroom spaces that is not allowing kids to thrive. And I think this idea of the unmet need, how many unmet needs happen before that act of violence happens, essentially?
It's a good question, Steph. It's a daunting problem, but one that I really think needs immediate attention, right? And so what the report is pointing to is a clear set of asks from our ministry: lower class sizes, more frontline school-based child and youth workers, educational assistants, social workers, and psychologists. I know I have a friend of mine who does the behavioral analyses for kids to make recommendations for additional supports to families, both inside and outside of schools. And she has met with so many parents who, with the cuts in the last 5 years, have lost access to some of their supports or haven't qualified based on what the new standards are and the lack of available resources. And so she has had so many, I think, heart-wrenching conversations with parents who are oftentimes dropping their child off at school. And the hope is not that they're going to learn to work on their cursive that day or solve, a simple addition problem. It's that they're not going to get hurt, because they know that their child has behavioral needs that the teacher simply can't meet. but they don't maybe have any other options. And so when I hear that as well, that is so disheartening. And that is clearly reflective of a system under strain.
Now, is there anything else, Kristy, that you wanted to bring our attention to in terms of thinking about safety in schools or anything else from the report before I share another thought about, thinking about Gabor Mate's line of inquiry? What are the conditions and what are the outcomes?
I think it's just echoing the need for children to feel safe, first and foremost, to thrive. And it's circling back to the point that we started with. So if we've removed the resources that children need to feel safe and reach full potential and learn in an environment that's conducive to helping them grow, we've changed the way that classrooms are supposed to function, the way that schools are run, and we've done a fundamental disservice to children, failing to provide for them the kind of environment where they can feel safe and learn effectively.
Yeah, you're right. And it is, without safety, there is no growth. It's the first step um, to get to where we want kids to be. So thank you for bringing that forward. I wanted to ask you, is there another environmental condition that you wanted to spotlight in this conversation today that you think doesn't yield the best outcome for our students?
So if you look at the academic research on the purpose of schooling from the 90s through there's traceable discussions of conflicting goals. And I feel like that really resonates with what I'm observing in our school system today. So everything from vocationalism and economic interests to the idea that it's supposed to create a citizenry ready for democratic participation. Those were kind of the standards at the time that the school system was more formally conceived. And now there seems to be this real shift towards individual gain, mobility through education. It's a currency that I need to weave my way through and access to basically get ahead in life. And so I wonder to what extent our system, because of the strains that it's under, because of this move towards a more individualistic mindset, has lost sense of like the collective sentiment of what it means to learn with other people, to care about their well-being, to thrive as a group rather than just as an individual. It seems to sort of be increasingly competitive, a protection of one's own interest. And I wonder to what extent we've shifted more towards that individualistic mindset in schooling.
Think I think there is a huge shift. I think it largely marks our education system, and I think it's imprinted in the minds of our students. I'd like to offer an anecdotal example just to kind of illustrate, or maybe even as a response to some of those big questions that you put forward. When I was supervising a study hall, and there was a group of students crowded around a table working on various subjects. I had a casual conversation. What are you working on? What are you preparing for, etc. And organically, the conversation of university came up and thinking about jobs because these were senior level students. And asked them, what types of programs are you going to be applying to and why? And the common narrative was, I want to apply to a program that's going to get me a job that's going to allow me to make the most money. And I go, well, what types of jobs are those? I got investment banker, I got doctor, I got dentist, owning my own company. And I don't think it's bad to want to be, successful or have a well-paying job, but no one thought of or even responded to the idea of, I really want to pursue this passion, or I really see the needs of the community here. I'd love to help these groups of people. It wasn't an answer that came up to the forefront. It was constantly, well, when I asked them what type of job or why did you pick these jobs? Again, the job that's going to, make me the most money, not the mindset and I guess it almost was the system being reflected back in the responses of the students. So when you think about this individual gain, this striving for success, it came out really strongly in the answers of the students. And again, it is not necessarily a bad thing, but my question is, what options are they not exploring as a result of this particular perspective or worldview? Are they asking themselves what they're interested in, or what do I want, or how can I use my voice or my skills or my talents for the better to make a positive impact? They very well might make a positive impact through those lines of work that they've identified, but I can't imagine that that's the answer for everybody, and that there might be a sense of fear or taking that step into the unknown when you have a very narrow window of what you feel success might look like.
Yeah, I think so much of what you just said, Steph, resonates with me. And I'd be lying if I said I haven't absolutely observed that shift too, especially as a guidance counselor, helping students plan for post secondary schooling and their motivations for entering certain programs. And I think, to be fair to the students too, they're growing up in a set of circumstances that are so different than when you and I were leaving school. There's so much noise around them all the time through social media and through this kind of curated, flashy lifestyle that they're seeing in short form, right? Through endless scrolling and videos. And not to bring it back to technology again, but I think it's this variable that you can't ignore when you talk about the mindset of students and how they're approaching their education and what their long-term goals are. And I think tracing that back to the purpose of schooling, right, and its sort of roots and origins, if we think about the idea of that newborn baby and their potential, school should also be a place where someone gets to know themselves, right? Their skills, their strengths, their way of understanding, their way of accessing the world. I wonder often if students are on this fast track to get from point A to point B as quickly and as efficiently and as successfully as possible, where does the actual learning beyond the curriculum happen, which is also such a fundamental purpose of school? How do I get to know myself? How do I get to know how I respond to failure, to setbacks? How do I grow from that? And what does that mean about me as a person and what I'm good at? I wonder how often they're getting that opportunity to self-reflect and to self-conceptualize.
When you say there's a lot of noise, I would have to agree with that. And I think our school system also perpetuates some of that noise or other narratives or, I guess, ways of doing life that wouldn't allow students to flourish or to be exploratory. Specifically, if I even just think around something as simple as the grading system or how we assess students, how there's a rubric with a very narrow set of items to check off to show what success looks like. Now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be metrics or that we can't teach skills, but what I am saying is if I'm constantly graded and assessed for things and someone else holds the power to determine whether or not, or I'm relying on them for a sense of validation if something is good or not, or I need this to be good from their perspective so that I can get to my program of choice, so I can get the high paying job. Um, you know, how could they possibly feel liberated to explore and stretch those borders, to think outside the box, to dip their toe in other things? So I think even just the rubrics and the grading system can be a form of noise that students have to navigate through.
And I think that structure and emphasis on grades and rubrics and meeting criteria too is creates this kind of back and forth of what matters most. And a system critique that I have is whether or not our K-12 system provides enough desirable difficulty, or has it become tailored to this path of least resistance, focused on, like I said, getting from point A to point B as efficiently and quickly and successfully as possible. I want to turn our attention to, I think, a great resource for this conversation, Carol Dweck, and she developed a concept called the growth mindset. So she's a Stanford psychologist who pioneered the concept in her 2006 book, The Mindset: The New Psychology for Success. And she was someone who studied academic tenacity because she was really interested in the factors that had to do with academic resilience and students' sense of self when it came to their learning. So she identified two categories, both a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. So a growth mindset is a learner's belief that their intelligence and abilities can expand and be developed. And a fixed mindset is that intelligence is fixed, immutable, and won't change despite their best efforts. So a really easy example to that is I've never been good at math. And how will that fixed mindset affect a student's journey from grade school all the way through for the rest of their life with this fixed notion that they can't and never will be good at this one thing? What her studies actually showed was that students who had a growth mindset consistently outperformed students with a fixed mindset, because the fixed mindset students were worried about proving their intelligence all the time rather than improving it. And they perceived themselves as being bad at things or dumb for not getting things right. while the growth mindset students responded with constructive thoughts, like asking how they might change their strategy or approach to answering a question. The reason that I think that this model and this research is so important is if we think about where failure creates a learning opportunity for students and to what extent the culture of our schooling today has shied away from that, right? I think anxiety comes up a lot as this term to describe how students are feeling. And sometimes I think it's accurately used, and sometimes I think it's embellished, or it's become this kind of blanket term for when we're feeling uncomfortable or apprehensive about something, because apprehension versus anxiety clinically are very, very different things. And so I wonder to what extent in creating that path to least resistance, we've also moved away from uncomfortable feelings when it comes to failure and setback as a means of growth.
I think you've offered, by calling on Carol Dweck, I think you offered us a really good guiding principle when it comes to think about making choices for our children. So, how can parents continue to foster this growth mindset within their children? And I think it comes down to language as well, because our words are so powerful. And so, if we want to continue to encourage our children to make mistakes, what types of words or what are we saying to our children to help allow for freedom of exploration? Maybe even a simple phrase like, I can't do something yet, but I can try again. I witnessed something, just the power of my words when I was helping my son learn how to dress. He's like, I can't do it. My for context, my son is 3 years old, so he's learning how to put on um his clothes, and sometimes some of them are a little bit tricky. And I saw him one time kind of feeling a little frustrated. And again, saw the automatic word, I can't do it. And I'm like, you can't do it yet. And that cheering and that encouragement. And then he put it on. He put on his sweater by himself and he was so happy. I
Mm.
know it's something that seems so small now, but I think it is the foundation for later on. So when your, kid comes home with a C on their science test, maybe it's, great effort. Like, let's look at what your strengths are. So just because you have a C now doesn't mean you can't get there yet. What did you learn? Look at all, even looking at the C is amazing in the sense that, like, look at all the things that you did retain and where can we go from there?
And I think applying tenacity to a goal is a way of uncovering strengths we didn't even know that we had also, and revealing so much about ourselves and our character and our resilience too. A silly example that I think of in understanding Carol Dweck's growth versus fixed mindset is, I ran track when I was in university. And so if I had the goal of saying, I want to qualify for the 100-meter sprint for the next Olympics, right? Maybe that's my goal. So a growth mindset approach would mean that I'm going to take a look at a periodized training plan. I'm going to get on board with a full nutrition plan, a weight program. I'm going to plan my meets around being able to compete against the country's best and fastest, right? And so maybe my goal is 2 years time. And in 2 years from now, I haven't qualified for the Olympics. So the fixed mindset would be I'm a bad sprinter. I'm slow. I should have never approached that goal. But the growth mindset and the learning piece there might be that I've learned so much about tailoring my strength training program based on where I'm progressing in my speed, learning how to bounce back from a particular injury, better understanding more about the macros that my body needs to put on a certain percentage of muscle, actually improving my time maybe within the national average for my age. Right. So there could be all kinds of different ways of looking at that beyond I didn't hit my goal, therefore I'm not good. And so I think so much learning and growth in other areas and facets can happen when we approach those setbacks as a greater opportunity for understanding ourselves.
And you know what, Kristy, this reminds me of one of the first things that you said about potential. And I know it's been sprinkled throughout our conversation, but when you talked about how a parent looks at their child, a newborn, and it's from love that they're looking at them that allows them to see potential. And so I think growth mindset is reminding us to put on that lens of love when we look at our children, because it is love that brings potential to fruition. It's not that we're doing anything as educators or as parents that will make them successful or not, in the sense that we're not handing them a skill, we're not handing them a specific quality. They have all those things within them. All that's required is creating a loving and nurturing environment that will allow for them to show us who they are. I think that is the essential ingredient. Even if you're a teacher and you're in a classroom space, it is keeping that fresh set of eyes, the reminder that, this child was once a newborn and here they are as a 12-year-old now. Here they are as a 17-year-old now. Um, and remembering that there is potential and possibility and reminding students to see that in themselves. And also sometimes just getting out of their way, getting our ego out of the way of how we want children to be, but letting them tell us who they are. And I think that is when, Carol Dweck's growth mindset can really, really support that sentiment.
I think you have me circling back to that relationship as well, Steph, right? In the spirit of nourishing that potential, the relationship between people in the system working for the system and parents, right? And trusting their child to it. And remembering that so much of the idealism that brings teachers to this profession in the first place is wanting to care for that potential and nurture it and do right by children. And so for parents who maybe had one of the themes that we've touched on today resonate with them, frustration about their child's safety, their approach to learning, the priorities in the community within their particular school, I think a great starting point is a conversation, right, with your child's teacher. I want to point to a study that I think encapsulates kind of the theme of what I'm trying to speak to. So a recent Gallup study revealed, and this is in the US context, but I think it always bleeds over here thematically. A record low of 35% of Americans are satisfied with the quality of K-12 education. At the same time, 74% of parents say that they are completely satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the quality of their own child's education, crediting their teachers and curriculum most often. So I do think parents see shades of that care and that attention through individual teachers when it comes to those touch points with their child. And remember that sometimes what you might not be happy with is something that's beyond an individual teacher's control, which is why starting with a conversation about your concerns is kind of step one. Then understanding the larger resources beyond that conversation if you're not happy with the outcome. If the next step is to go to your child's administrator, again, approach that conversation diplomatically, bringing forth your concerns, seeing, what power they have and what power they don't. And then again, understanding next steps, because sometimes it means going, especially in the current system, I think beyond the school. I want to let parents know that as of January of 2026, knowing that there are these concerns, especially around safety and class size, the ministry has mandated in all of the major boards, student and family support offices. And so these are supposed to be resource hubs that parents can reach out to and contact regarding their individual concerns, especially if a school principal is unable to help. And they're required to respond to inquiries within 2 business days, is what it says online. So that could be a potential next step too, if you find you're not getting anywhere with those individual kind of frontline conversations.
And also, speaking as a parent, think about, because Kristy had talked about how there's a lot of noise for kids. And also ask you, whenever you bring up a concern, just kind of go through that filtering process. Is this noise that I've also picked up, or is it a genuine concern that I have for my child? When I voice a concern, have I adopted one of the narratives that are out there of what my child should look like and should be like? Oh, well, they need this in order to get this, or is it a genuine concern for your child's well-being? And I think filtering through that can also help you to help your child in the best way possible.
And then I guess just thinking about the parent-child conversation too, for me, Stephanie, dialogue is such a powerful tool when it comes to understanding how they're doing at school, how they view themselves as a learner, their sense of self, that self-conception. I can't believe the conversations that I think sometimes I'm having that are over my 5-year-old's head that he'll repeat back to me then later. So if you're having a discussion about schooling at home in front of your child that's overtly negative and about the teacher and all the things that it's not doing, ask yourself as well how that's shaping their perception of going to that classroom in that space every single day. Ask them how answering a question in front of their classmates makes them feel, how they work together to problem solve with somebody. Anything that's kind of rooted in a development of their emotional intelligence and their language around their feelings is also really powerful when it comes to how they understand themselves. We spent a lot of time in episode 3, if you haven't listened to that one yet, talking about how the larger our language is, the greater our worldview and our understanding of the world. So arming kids really young with that language to describe how they're feeling at school, how they're learning, how school, helps them understand themselves is really a powerful tool to knowing if those needs are being met.
And also for them to explore the world of extracurriculars, because I think so much beauty comes in those spaces, having led extracurriculars as an educator. And I love it because I think there's the most space there for children to shine. And really, I think extracurriculars can be should actually be the model of how school is done in general, because in an extracurricular space, you have an interested teacher typically, and, students gravitate towards this extracurricular based on their own interests. And I've led, service initiatives or certain clubs that come from the promptings of a student's heart. And it's beautiful, the things that they've created you know, again, how much food that they've raised for the homeless, how they've gone out into the streets of, Toronto and delivered sandwiches or meal kits or basic necessities because of their genuine interest in exploring issues in the city and wanting to do something about it. So I think, creating a space for children to explore extracurriculars can also allow students to find their voice and create a unique stamp within their educational space when sometimes maybe traditional classrooms might not have enough room um, to do that.
I think that's such an important point, Steph. I just want to echo that is a fundamental pedagogical belief of mine that extracurriculars are such a necessary and key ingredient in education. Kids need programming outside of a classroom. They need to meet in spaces with other kids, work together, problem solve, compete, grow, challenge themselves, whether that be on a court, in an arena, on the other side of a chessboard, building a robot, whatever that opportunity looks like for them. Figure out what it is that they love. And I think at especially a time when we're fighting against increasing isolationism through technology, seek out those in-person opportunities. Dr. DeSantis in our third episode spoke about athletes having less of a negative impact of social media than their peers because they're getting that physical in-person space with other people. And so I think make sure that you're capitalizing on those opportunities. If you're in a school where there's program cuts, think about things like summer camps, look at community center offerings, and just see what those opportunities are to get them in a physical space with other kids, because there's such critical learning that happens there. I think about as a coach, some of my favorite memories are after hours on the track with our guys talking about life, the things that they've learned that week, the frustrations that they have. And there's so much more that comes through those conversations in those spaces sometimes than a formal classroom. I've watched teammates work through their own internal politics at the back of a school bus in ways that have taught me so much. Kids are sometimes our greatest teachers too, and we need to give them the space to grow and explore who they are with their peers.
I love those examples because you've highlighted those little kernels of light and of joy that happen in, the educational system that we can, not only focusing on the negative, but turning to the positive to understand which direction that we want to take our school system and what kind of environmental conditions that we want to create for our, the students in our care.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So thank you so much for listening. And as always, just because our conversation is coming to a close today, it does not mean that we are done talking about these beautiful things. So please stay tuned as we also welcome guests from different experiences and walks of life to shed their insight and perspective on human potential.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for guiding us through this topic. And I hope parents were able to take away some food for thought around how best to both nourish and advocate for your child's full potential. Thanks for joining us.